You're listening to Planet Zero, an original science fiction story by Brian Donahue. Read by the author. Chapter 8, The Plan. The young pilot looked up at his commander and asked, "Does your plan involve any more hand lasers?" Gates shook his head and turned toward his crew, who were all trying to process what just happened. Had their commander just killed their colleague and friend? Even Fox was stunned, and he was the only one bleeding and reeling from the pain of the deceiver's assault on his body. He was still sprawled out on the floor. The commander pierced the silence with what he hoped were confident-sounding words. "That wasn't our crewmate. It was an imposter, a replica, a very good replica of our Cheryl. Nothing more than a robot programmed to deceive and stall us from taking action." Chief Science Officer Brooks broke into the conversation and asked, "How can you be sure, Commander? She certainly looked like her and sounded like her, minus the whole sounding like a mechanical robot thing." Gates looked at Brooks intensely and answered confidently, "That wasn't her. If they really wanted to gain our trust, they would have given her more emotion, even her memories, the things that make Cheryl unique. They just copied her body and used it as a distraction to get us closer to whatever that thing is." Wright shook his head and added, "The biggest mousetrap in the history of humankind." He turned back to his station and then added another thought. He said, "Commander, where's the bait?" Commander Gates raised his eyebrows in consideration, stood up taller, and crossed his arms. He continued to stare out the window at the object looming before them and said, "That's an interesting question, Mr. Wright. If we are to explore this metaphor to its conclusion, then there must have been something... Wait a minute." Gates moved swiftly to the sensor station 1. He gazed at the readouts and then asked, "Have the computers analyzed the source of the beam yet? The one that sent us that robot?" Danielle Johnson replied, "Almost, but so far it's inconclusive. I don't think there's anything there that can explain how they could help us." He moved across the way to Center Station 2 that was being manned by James Miller. The commander leaned in to see the readouts on Miller's station and said, "I'm not looking for how they beamed Cheryl off the ship, or even why. I just want a point of origin for that beam." Miller nodded his head in understanding and added, "If we can discover the point of origin, it might give us a clue as to where Cheryl may be." Gates smiled at Miller and lightly smacked the man's shoulder with his hand. "We're looking for a door or a hatch of some kind. I'm all of a sudden less interested in technology than I am in finding a way inside." Weapons Officer Stephen Moore broke into the conversation. "Are you saying you want to attempt a rescue mission, Commander?" Gates stood upright and answered emphatically, "That's exactly what I'm saying." Moore cleared his throat, as he was known for doing quite often, and said, "Commander, I'm sure you're aware of the incredible risk of such an attempt in such hostile space and circumstances. We've never tested the new ISRS this far out into interstellar space before. It's only been flown in and around the Earth, the Moon, and Mars." The ISRS stood for Independent Short-Range Shuttle. It was designed to take people from the surface of a planet, mainly the Earth, the Moon, and Mars, to an orbiting ship or space station. The idea was that the ISRS would serve well aboard the Redemption for its inevitable first contact mission, should they need to land on a planet. It could also serve as a convoy to other spacefaring vessels they should happen to meet along the way. The idea of teleportation was something only dreamed up in science fiction entertainment from its history. This shuttle was the only means for anyone, from the Redemption, to leave the ship outside of dry dock. Ensign Wright, Redemption's enthusiastic pilot, became very excited and shouted, "Well, all right!" Gates and the rest of the crew smiled at the young man's enthusiasm. Gates responded, "Let's slow down a minute and take a breath, though. Mr. Wright and Mr. Fox, please head down to the shuttle bay and begin preparations for a space flight." The two men looked at each other and then at their commander. They nodded at each other and then promptly rose to leave after acknowledging Gates' orders almost in unison. Gates went back to his command station and sat down. He tapped the ship-wide communications button and began speaking. His voice reverberated throughout the corridors of the Redemption. "This is Commander Gates. I've ordered Fox and Moore to prep the ISRS for a rescue mission of kidnapped crew member Cheryl Atkinson. We're analyzing data and forming a plan as we speak, but I wanted to make you aware of our current situation. You no doubt have been watching the bridge feed as we encountered the mysterious object from the planet, was subjected to its intrusive beam and stalled by the manufactured representation of Atkinson. We have been drawn uncomfortably close to the planet, and I intend to use our close proximity to our favor by using the ISRS to get us into the heart of that thing. The bridge feed was a resource implemented by the planner so that other crew members not in the command center could see and hear what was happening in real time. That way, they might better understand orders sent down from above and react accordingly. Gates continued, I need the next in line for the command center post currently vacant. Once we've formulated a plan, I'll inform the entire crew again. I need everyone to give their best over the next few hours. We're literally facing life or death here. Rest assured, I intend to find Atkinson's and bring her back, assuming she's still alive. Commander Gates out. He pressed the button again and rose from his chair. Science Officer Brooks rose and met him in the middle of the command center. The two men stood there for a moment, talking through their situation, when the replacements arrived. Gates turned to greet the new arrivals as they passed through the short and dark hallway into the command center. Both of the new crew members stood at attention at the sight of Commander Gates. Relax, guys, Gates said. We're working here and formalities only slow things down. The new arrivals relaxed their shoulders, smiled uncomfortably, and breathed sighs of relief. Being in the command center for the first time was pressure enough, but to get called up during a crisis was another level of stress and pressure entirely. Engineer Adina Montgomery was a slightly shorter than average woman with long graying hair that laid gracefully on her shoulders. She was middle-aged but still had a lot of spunk, even in the way she walked. Gates had familiarized himself with all of the crew records before the mission began, but he had yet to meet these two crew members until now. He liked Adina and the energy she brought to the command center instantly. She had a humble confidence that impressed him. He also knew that this was not her first time in space. Adina had been responsible for key contributions to the engine design of Earth's redemption and helped push the initial project past some of its early struggles. She was a problem solver, and her records showed that she flourished under such circumstances. Gates was happy to have her on the command deck. The other crew member was a bit more fidgety and inexperienced. Todd Burton was anxious and not doing a good job of hiding it. Gates was a bit concerned about this, but also knew that Burton's record was spotless and even heroic. Todd Burton was a dark-haired young man in his 20s. He had dark brown eyes that had seen a devastating amount of violent combat experience in the Third World War, a pivotal event in Earth's history, one that helped push humanity to the brink of self-destruction. Burton was a weapons expert, but his real weapon was his expertise in the martial arts. His most dynamic story from the war revolved around an intense moment when he became surrounded by enemy forces and had no other choice but to use his special skills to defend himself and put down his attackers. 12 other men lost their lives that day, and Burton became a legend. Gates addressed both of the officers before him. Welcome to the command center, and thank you for responding so quickly to my call. Please make yourself familiar with each of your stations. In a few minutes, we'll begin working on the plan to get our crew member back. The two officers found their stations and went to work immediately to understand their respective controls. They, of course, had training in command center simulations, but being there under very real and unique circumstances such as this meant they needed to know where every single button and lever was so they could quickly respond in the heat of the moment to their commander's orders. Commander Gates addressed the entire command center crew. Everyone settled in? It's time we work on the plan to get our Cheryl back. Chapter 9, Slow Implementation. So let me get this straight, said Gates. That small-looking black dot at the base of this structure seems to be hollow? He shook his head in disbelief and asked, Are you sure, Miller? James Miller shook his head yes as he squinted his eyes at the readout. I'm positive, Commander. That is a hollow opening of some kind, and it appears to be quite deep. It could very well be an entrance or access point to the inner workings of this object. Miller had been hard at work analyzing the data coming in from the moment the ocean below began to open up, revealing the ominous-looking and huge object that was pulling them closer to Planet Zero. He had loaded the data into his 3D imaging pad and was able to manipulate and move the image so he could view it from every angle except from the bottom side of the object. The Redemption's sensors were still unable to penetrate very deeply past the object, as if it lifted higher and higher into the planet's atmosphere. Gates looked at Johnson at the opposite sensor station and asked, "Do you concur, Danielle?" Gates was sure of his decision, but wanted to bring as many people as possible into the same line of thinking, so they would be unified when he gave the order to pursue the actual rescue of their shipmate. Johnson turned in her chair and answered confidently, "It looks hollow to me, too. If I had to bet, that's our best way in." The newly arrived engineer, Adina, asked, "Just how big is that opening? I mean, can the ISRS fit inside?" "It can for about 20 meters. After that, whatever lies beyond that will have to be traversed by crew and space tech. My scans can only penetrate so deep, and there's at least 100 meters after that before my scans start bouncing back to me. We'll need tools in case we need to open a hatch," said Adina. Burton added, "Maybe even some explosives if we need to barge our way in. Of course, we'll need some kind of shield to protect us from the blast." Gates smiled. "Hopefully they'll answer our knock and that won't be necessary, Mr. Burton. But let's be prepared for all possibilities." Burton smiled back and said, "I'll take care of it, Commander. Permission to leave the command deck in order to prepare the supplies? This will take a lot of gear, and I'll need help hauling it and installing it if you give the call." Gates responded, "Permission granted. Please see to it and meet us at the launch bay in 30 minutes. Don't be late." Burton nodded with anticipation and said as he turned to leave, "I never miss a good party, sir. Oh, and Commander, may I suggest we all be fitted with hand lasers? We may need to defend ourselves once we go trespassing in there, whatever that thing is." Gates paused for the slightest of seconds and answered, "That's probably a good idea." Burton and Gates nodded at each other as the weapons expert made his exit. Science Officer Brooks stepped forward. "Commander, are you sure you want to go out there? We don't know what effects this space will have on our space tech, or even if it can handle the pressure this far out from our own solar system. The rules may be different out here." Gates sat down in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and leaned on his right elbow. He rested his chin in his hand and thought for a moment. Brooks was right. This mission was particularly dangerous, not just because every mission in space is dangerous, but because they were facing a hostile situation. He finally spoke up. "The only other alternative is to hightail it out of here without knowing if Cheryl is still alive." Brooks shook his head intently. "I'm not asking you to reconsider, Commander. I'm just checking to make sure you're considering the risks to the crew and to this ship, and making a call based on more than just the pain of losing a crew member." "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Brooks. And thanks for asking the hard question no one else wanted to ask." Gates smiled at his chief science officer, who was also someone he trusted as a friend, to give him solid advice when he needed. They had spent many a long night playing cards over a bottle of Gates's favorite bourbon. It was during one of those such late-night games and discussions that he had invited Brooks to feel free to play devil's advocate if he felt it was needed, even in tense situations on the command deck. Gates stood to his feet as non-aggressively as he could to give the crew the feeling that he was not offended or intimidated by the chief science officer's comment. He continued, "I believe that Cheryl is still alive and is being held against her will. If I didn't, then we would be forming a plan to blast out of here. My decision is based on that conviction." Brooks put his hand on the commander's shoulder and looked with reassuring confidence. "Very well, sir. I'm with you 100%. Johnson and Miller stood to their feet and echoed, "We're with you too, sir." Montgomery shifted her stance, straightened her shoulders, and added, "I'm with you, sir." She hesitated and asked, "Will I be joining you on this mission or monitoring from the command deck?" Gates was curious and asked, "Do you have a preference?" Before Adina could answer, the ship shook violently. Everyone braced themselves as well as they could, but it still hurt. Gates gripped his chair and barked, "Report! What's happening now?" Johnson was the first to respond. Waves are pulsating from the object again, Commander. They're not just passing through us this time, though. They seem to be thicker and more mean. Gates reached his chair and collapsed into it. Breathing hard, he shouted, Can we turn the ship into it and ride it out any better? There was no answer. It was only then that the commander realized that a new pilot had never reported for duty. Frank Wright was down in the launch bay preparing the ISRS with Fox. This was an oversight he suddenly regretted deeply. As the ship was blasted with another wave of energy, Gates yelled out, Mr. Moore, take over the pilot station and see if you can turn us into the wave. We need maneuverability. Aye, Commander, yelled back Moore. He moved as quickly and gingerly as he could to the seat beside his own weapons console. He put his hands on the side of the workstation, took a deep breath, and went to work. His years of experience had afforded him the opportunity to become acquainted with multiple stations for such emergencies as this. It's no use, Commander, he called out. The gravitational pull from these waves makes it impossible to turn the ship. We're stuck here until they stop. Gates asked the engineer in the room, Adina, a fast question. Can we launch the ISRS under these conditions? This complicates things, and I'm afraid we're running out of time. Adina shook her head. I'd wait until these waves die down. Right now, I don't know how Redemption isn't getting ripped apart. The ISRS wasn't designed for anything other than smooth sailing. It would be extremely risky to attempt spaceflight in such a small vehicle. Copy that, responded Gates as he clung to his chair. This round of waves was definitely more violent and destructive than what they had experienced before the fake Cheryl appeared. He didn't much care for what his greater act of aggression against his ship implied. He finally made a decision he had been hesitant to make before. He called out directly to his weapons officer, Stephen Moore, again. Mr. Moore, can you warm up our defensive lasers, please? Moore looked back at the commander, rolled his eyes, and shifted seats again. Your wish is my command, Commander. I've never had to warm them up under such duress before. It may take a minute or two. Understood, responded Gates. He knew Moore would get it done as he always did. Moore was due to retire after this mission, and for some reason, that fact came to the forefront of the commander's awareness. He wanted to see that day come, and so he made a decision he felt would give him a greater chance at seeing it happen. We need to move to the launch bay. If the waves that thing is hitting us with stop, I want to be ready to launch. Brooks, Moore, Miller, stay here to help monitor and steer the ship. Montgomery and Johnson are with me. I want new crew members at each station before I get to the launch bay. Is that understood, Mr. Moore? Moore nodded emphatically and said, Aye, Commander. Consider it done. Gates, the engineer, and the sensor officer moved with intention towards the exit of the command deck. As they did, Brooks called out, Commander, Godspeed. Bring Cheryl back to us. Gates stopped with his hands on both sides of the small and dark hallway leading out of the command deck, turned and said, We'll get her back even if we have to travel down the belly of this beast and into the recesses of hell itself. We'll get her back. Moore piped up enthusiastically, Bravo, Commander, bravo! The three brave crew members disappeared into the darkness of the hallway and out of sight from the command deck. Moore took a deep breath and punched in communications at his console, hand-picking the replacement crew with Priority 1 messages. He turned to Brooks and Miller. They were resolute-looking but obviously nervous, as they both knew Moore was in charge because he was the senior officer on deck. Moore smiled and said, It's okay, boys. This isn't my first rodeo. Let's get busy making sure things are as perfect as they can be for the launch. The rest of our team will be here in a minute, and we'll need to bring them up to speed. He turned back to his station and squinted his eyes as he looked intently at the object protruding from the planet below. He said to himself, You bastardly monster. Where are you hiding, my friend?